Hello and welcome to this video on the beginnings of epidemiology. With COVID-19 on just about everyone's mind for one reason or another, many may not realize just how humble the beginnings of our knowledge about the spread of disease really are. Way back when, there were different theories on how diseases spread. Some said a punishment by the gods, others said it was dirt. Then we had miasmas or bad smells. Then there were the humours of the body which when disturbed created illness. This is much like the theory that naturopathy and chiropractors rely on. All of these ideas came well before germ theory or our entire understanding of disease. By the 19th century, there was a general idea that disease did not come from nowhere. It was not caused by the gods. Dirt was seen as bad, but even those who washed obsessively were not free from disease. This left miasmas and the four humours. While bloodletting was used to relieve the body of foul humours, it did not produce results. Well, at least nothing of any benefit. It had a relatively high rate of infection. Strangely though, removing foul odours did. This could be because miasmas carried diseases, or that in order to remove the stink, the area where the smell was found was cleaned of every form of feces, rubbish, and everything in between. This situation and all the confusion is typified by the Great Stink of London in 1858. At this time, the weather was extremely hot. Londoners would dump their waste in the street, which may have found its way to the River Thames, or industrial waste was dumped directly there. Combining heat and this waste led to a horrid smell. The miasma from the effluent was thought to be what was carrying disease. Around this time, there were 3 major outbreaks of cholera, and these were all blamed on the river being full of feces and other waste. London dealt with this by building one of the best sewer systems of the time to take the waste away from London. This took more than 18 years to finish, but worked to remove the sewage and other waste. Before that could be finished though, other major developments occurred. While the London sewer system was rebuilt, another monumental event in public health occurred, and this is where Jon Snow comes in. He took a different approach to understanding what was happening. Where the sewer system was a public health and utility measure, he looked at this as an early epidemiologist. The historical backdrop of poorly disposed sewage and waste acted as the foundations for Jon Snow. This situation led to many diseases, and it included cholera. Cholera is an infection of the small intestine, and is caused by a number of the strains of the bacterium called Vibrio cholerae. The symptoms can be quite mild. Think of simple diarrhea to begin with. The more advanced symptoms can be quite devastating. This goes from more serious diarrhea to vomiting, muscle cramps, and eventually death. The causality of this is the body is trying to dispose of the parasite by getting it out the other end of the GI tract as quickly as possible. Symptoms can occur within 2 hours and as late as 5 days. That means there's a large window in which someone can become diseased and spread cholera very quickly, but they can keep spreading it for quite a while. That same wide time frame makes it difficult to figure out just when someone has picked up the disease. This can cause a lot of problems. The biggest, as mentioned, was illness, but also death. Death was particularly prevalent amongst those who were weak, young, or immunocompromised. In just the 50 or so years before this occurred in 1858, more than 40,000 people died due to cholera. Fortunately today, we have both the knowledge that winter is coming. No, wait. Different Jon Snow. Knowledge that cholera can be transmitted in water, and we have a vaccine for it. Cholera is a pathogen which goes from humans to water. It then goes back to the human host when you drink fecally contaminated water. This is known as the fecal oral route. Jon Snow was a physician or doctor in London at the time who spent a lot of his time before this studying cholera, trying to figure out just what was happening. he found that, at least initially, symptoms appear to be related to the GI tract. This was, by his reasoning, a direct association with something that was consumed orally, not something that was in the air. If it was miasma, he should have seen respiratory symptoms first, not GI tract issues. This led him to the inevitable conclusion that whatever was causing it could be found in water or food. Jon Snow began talking to residents around the area where one of the major outbreaks had occurred. He found, through these interviews, that the outbreak appeared to be associated with a water pump. Technology and science in general at the time meant that his chemical and microbial observations of the water samples could find nothing definitive. What he did find, though, was able to be proven, let's say, through statistics. He was able to get enough evidence and be able to plot it and present it well enough that he could get the local council to disable the pump and the well in the area. This meant that the water that was contaminated with the cholera could not be consumed. This led to something of a decline in the cholera outbreak in the area. The observations for this study were made possible and much more compelling by not only the evidence which fit the pattern, but the evidence which at first glance did not fit the pattern of causation. He took a map and began dotting on the map where the cases were occurring. The cluster began to concentrate around the pump in question. This allowed him to then demonstrate exactly where the issue seemed to be coming from. He further expanded on this by tracking down just where water was being sourced by and who it was being supplied by. Water being brought in from one company appeared to be brought in from a different location to a second. The first company seemed to be getting its water from the Thames. The Thames, as we've mentioned, was full of waste at this moment. The other company was found much further out and appeared to be getting water which was clean. The difference between the incidents for the areas the two companies supplied was that the first, with Thames water, had a 14 times higher rate of cholera than from the other company. So far, this was incredibly compelling. The problem was that he had several outliers. An anecdotal example of this was that of an older woman who lived well outside the areas that should have been serviced. She came down with cholera and seemed to have no obvious association with the pump in question. She was not in the area that received the contaminated water. It turns out that she did in fact drink the water that was contaminated because her child brought it to her as the taste was better to her liking. This means that her case of cholera had a direct connection to the same pump that seemed to be so closely associated to every other case. Researchers have later discovered that the pump and well were dug only a few feet, just under a meter, from a cesspit. This cesspit had become disserviced and disheveled, leading to it leaking the contents. The cesspit being full of fecal material, you can imagine what it was full of. It wasn't until more than 8 years later, in 1866, that Jon Snow's proposition of where the cholera was coming from began to get more attention, and this was simply because his body of evidence was so compelling that even those who were opposing his theory had to admit that there was some fundamental truth to it. William Farr was one of these individuals, and he kept arguing that this couldn't be the case. But the problem for Farr was that when he investigated another case, he found that the only way to stop the outbreak in this new area was to boil water. Water that until now he had argued could not be associated with the cholera outbreak. Even still, for the next 50 years, there was resistance and reticence to accept the concept of Snow's causality. Eventually he was vindicated, but not for lack of trying. It's only Pasteur's germ theory and the fact that spontaneous life can't happen, and the means by which certain diseases can spread, was proved that we now know that Jon Snow was right, that cholera was spread through a particular mechanism, and this eventually led to the foundations of what we know today as germ theory, but also epidemiology and public health. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.